Alright guys, what we're going to do today is we are going to talk about genetics, right? We're just going to do intro vocab type stuff. Now, whenever we talk about genetics, the very first thing we have to do is go back to sexual reproduction, right? And when we talked about sexual reproduction, really what this is coming down to is that we want to create, oh dear, that's an awful marker, that we want to create genetically different offspring, right? That was our entire goal, was to get genetically different offspring, because if you're genetically different, then you have a better chance of surviving in an environment that's changing. So let's talk about how sexual reproduction works again. All right, if we're talking about sex, that means we're going to involve two different gametes, right? We're going to involve my egg, and then we're going to involve my sperm. So there they are, and remember, each of these egg and sperm, these gametes, are haploid. So that means my egg has half the chromosomes and my sperm has half the chromosomes. Then when these two come together, that process is called fertilization. And when fertilization occurs, I get to make that one cell. Remember, this one cell right here, this is referred to as a zygote. And because I have half the information, that means I have a whole set, and my whole set, that's diploid. Because di means two, and I get one set from my mom, and I'm going to get one set from my dad. Okay? And so what we're going to do is we are going to talk about how we actually get the genetically different part of it. We've talked about chromosome number and how we have two halves to make a whole, but now we're going to talk about how we pass traits on. That entire idea is referred to as heredity. So heredity is just passing on genetic information from your parents, right, to you. So now we can talk a little bit about DNA again. Remember, this is kind of everything. So here's my DNA molecule, and then maybe right here, this is a section of DNA. So a segment of DNA. A segment of DNA, that's called a gene. And what a gene does, right? A gene is going to code for a protein. And we know my protein is just the physical expression of a gene. Because when we go back through everything that we've talked about, right? So when you have a gene, you have two copies of it. Why do you have two copies? Because you get one copy from your mom, and you're going to get one copy from your dad, right? That's where, again, the word diploid comes from, because di means two. Since you get two copies of every gene, there's actually a nice little word for that, right? This is called a genotype. So a geno, right? Geno is gene. A genotype are just the genes for a trait. So a genotype is just talking about the genes themselves, those segments of DNA. But if we want to do any type of genetic studies, we can't just list off all the nucleotides for a gene, because that would get super messy. And so what we do for a genotype is we get to use letters. And because a genotype, remember, you get one from your mom, one from your dad, you get to use two letters. And I'll just use the letter A, because that's the most familiar. So a genotype, I can either have a big A, or I can have a little a. And so then, since I get two of them, I can either get two big A's, right? So like maybe here's my egg. Maybe my mom had a big A for a gene, and maybe my dad had a big A for a gene. And when they came together, you got your two copies and now you have two big A's. Or maybe you get a big A and a little a. So same situation. So here's my egg, and maybe that had a little a. Here's my sperm. He had a big A when they came together. That gave you a big and a little. Or you can get two little a's. Same thing. Here's my egg with a little a. Here's my sperm with a little a. And then there you are, and you get two little a's. That's all genotypes are. Genotypes are just using letters to tell what kind of genes you have. And since we don't want to write out big, long strands, you know, if this were my DNA molecule, we don't want to write out all of those letters right there for the nucleotides. It's a lot simpler to do something like this. But now we need to start naming these genotypes. Well, if you look at these two letters are the same. And there's a fancy word for that. So think about the word root for same. That's called homo. So when we talk about genotypes, this is a homozygous genotype, because homo means same, they're the same. Also down here, these are two little letters. They're the same. So this is going to be referred to as homozygous. Now these two right here, this is a big and a little. So they're not the same, they're different. And since they're different, we have a word for that. That's called a heterozygous. All right, so now for genotypes, we can use letters, right? So we can have big A, big A. This is a homozygous genotype. We can have little a, little a. This is a homozygous genotype. Or I can have a big and a little. This is a heterozygous genotype. But we are not going to stop just right there, because whenever we've talked about, you know, our flow of information, here's our DNA, and then of course we'll carry it someplace, but ultimately I'm going to code for a protein. So what I'm going to do is my DNA, right? Those are where my genes are located, and so I'm going to talk about my genotype. But I still need to talk about the physical expression. Well, there's a fancy word for physical expression, protein. That's called a phenotype, because pheno is physical. So maybe I have a genotype, right? Those are my genes. Maybe my genotype is big A, and maybe that big A is going to code for a person that's really tall. All right, like that's just how it is. Here's my DNA, here's my information, and then here's my physical expression of it. My genes tell me what I'm going to look like. All right, now a little bit more vocab, because that's all this is. When I look at each individual letter, right, so if I look at big A, or maybe there was a little a, those have a name. So if it's this or this, these are called an allele. An allele, what it is it's an alternative form of a gene. And so maybe this big A, right? Maybe this big A codes for a person to be tall, and then a little a, that codes for a person to be short, right? They're both coding for height, right? That's what my gene is. My gene is for height, and then I have different forms of my gene. I can either be a tall or I can be short. That's all alleles are just alternative form of whatever that gene is. So the gene, right, is going to code for a trait, right? And then I can have alternative forms of a trait. Like maybe my trait is eye color. Well, and then what are my alternative forms? Okay, well, I can have blue eyes, or I can have brown eyes. That's all it is, but we need to come up with some type of system. That's why we use the letters, either big, 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 little, or little, little. So now, when we talk about this genetic stuff, when we talk about genotypes, a genotype, right? Because some genes you're going to see expressed more than others. And so remember, here's my 3 genotypes: big A, big A, big A, little a, little a, little a. All right, we know big A is homozygous. But when we talk about, going back to that whole allele word, an alternative form, sometimes one allele will override another. So perhaps, when we're talking about, let's just do eye color, right? If you survey a bunch of people, you are going to see maybe brown eyes more than blue eyes. Well, that's because my brown allele, we'll call that big A, and this can be little a. My brown allele, this is going to override any of those little ones. All right? And so when we have one allele that overrides another, we call that dominant. So up here, since I have, and we're going to have to use letters for it, so we'll use capital. So this is going to be a homozygous dominant. That means it'll show the dominant trait, where it only takes one. Maybe we could define that. So a dominant trait means you only need one allele to show it. Okay? And so if we look at this guy, well, big A, little a, this is heterozygous. But since he has a big A, he's going to overshadow that little a. So you're not going to get a mix of brown and blue. You're just going to see brown, sorry. That is still going to be a dominant trait. But then, when we talk about recessive alleles, recessive alleles, so recessive traits, that means you need 2 of the alleles to show it. And so down here, even though they're homozygous, this is going to show my recessive trait. And so, just to sum up, let's go back through all the words, right? When we talk about a genotype, it's just the combo of alleles where you get one from mom, you get one from dad. And so my genotypes are either going to be big, because I get one from each parent, or I can have a big and a little, or I can have a little and a little. All right, so let's go ahead and name them. Since those are the same, this is a homozygous genotype, and since I have at least one capital letter, it'll show the dominant trait. This right here, big A, little a, they're different, so that's heterozygous, but because he has at least one big letter, he'll show the dominant trait. And then these two, they're the same, so I know that's called homozygous, but because they're 2 little letters, they're going to show the recessive trait. All right, so then, but those are genotypes. Remember, genotype is just a gene. Can you guys see a gene? No, you can see the proteins that the genes code for. And so that's where the word phenotype comes in. Phenotype is the physical expression of my gene. And so that's where we start using these words right here, this dominant and recessive, because it'll tell me what it looks like. It'll tell me if it's brown eyes or blue eyes, or if I'm tall or if I'm short. And then another word that we need to make sure we're familiar with is allele. An allele is just the alternative form of a trait, right? And so if my trait is height, then my alternative forms would be tall, or I can be short. And so when we do this, it kind of ties it all together, right? Alternative forms. So maybe my genotype is big A, little a, all right, and then my phenotype, right, phenotype, maybe my phenotype would be tall. So I have 2 alleles to make up my genotype, and then those code for a phenotype. And so if I have 2 big A's, we'll just go ahead and say tall is dominant and short's recessive. If I have two big A's, that's going to give me a tall person. But if I have two little a's, that's a recessive trait, and this person will be short. All right, that's all the vocab that you need to start off this unit. You guys know if you have any questions, you let me know.